we have no evidence for most of the facts or events of history. We have no idea what evidence there would be for these, but they're facts nonetheless. So Christianity stands or falls on the fact of Jesus' resurrection, but it doesn't stand or fall on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Indeed, it would be rather remarkable if there were evidence for such an extraordinary event.
Welcome to Closer to Truth, where we explore deep questions of existence, including arguments for and against the existence of God, and if there were a God, what might follow. Closer to Truth promotes no privileged position. Rather, we seek precision and clarity in diverse, even conflicting views. We do not mind challenging current belief. I am speaking with William Lane Craig about his philosophical theology research projects over the course of his remarkable career. Here, historical evidence of the resurrection of Jesus. Bill has authored or edited over 30 books, including The Sun Rises, Historical Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus. Bill is recognized as a leading defender of theism in general and of Christianity in specific. The premise of this session is that God exists and the Bible in some sense is valid. This is not the premise of Closer to Truth, which examines the former but not the latter. Bill, welcome. Let's start with your conclusion. Please summarize the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.
I think that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection can be summarized under three broad facts. Number one would be the discovery of his empty tomb by a group of his women disciples on the Sunday following his crucifixion. Number two would be the post-mortem appearances of Jesus that were experienced by the earliest disciples. And number three would be the very origin of the disciples' belief that God had raised him from the dead. And I think that the best explanation of those three facts is the one that the disciples themselves gave, namely, God raised Jesus from the dead.
The resurrection, of course, is the core of the Christian faith. So I assume that for your research of the reality or the historicity of the resurrection, everything is at stake.
Well, not exactly, Robert, because I distinguish between the fact of the resurrection and the evidence for the resurrection.
Okay.
Think about it. We have no evidence for most of the facts or events of history. We have no idea what evidence there would be for these, but they're facts nonetheless. So Christianity stands or falls on the fact of Jesus' resurrection, but it doesn't stand or fall on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Indeed, it would be rather remarkable if there were evidence for such an extraordinary event. And I think it came as quite a surprise to me in doing my work at the University of Munich in Germany on this, that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is so powerful.
When you started believing in the resurrection as having occurred, but not knowing what the historicity was, what were some of the initial questions that you had or the issues that you faced?
I think that for me initially, my question was whether or not these accounts in the New Testament of what happened to Jesus' body after his death, whether these were legendary or not. And I anticipated that one would try to show that these accounts were written fairly early on and therefore were not as susceptible to legendary influences. But in the course of my work, things quite changed, and I began to explore the historical traditions that lie behind the New Testament and then drive us even closer back to the original events themselves. And so the evidence that emerged was much, much stronger than I ever anticipated it would be.
Do you remember your first discovery or conviction that you didn't know, but when you realized that it would form a core of your thinking going forward?
I don't remember exactly, but I would think that the discovery that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is quoting from an old formula that he himself had received that probably goes back to the original church in Jerusalem within 5 years after the crucifixion. That is astonishingly early, and makes that piece of evidence one of the most important in the New Testament.
Bill, as you well know, there is a large scholarly literature giving alternative explanations. Scholars who are not believers do not find evidence of a bodily resurrection compelling. Maybe this is a tautology. One critique is that the Gospels themselves on this topic are, as one scholar told me, hopelessly contradictory. For example, whether Jesus appeared in Galilee and or Jerusalem. Mark, supposedly the earliest gospel, has no appearances in its original ending, is what I've been told.
When you read New Testament scholars on the gospel narratives, what you find is that they're not overly concerned about the inconsistencies between the narratives, because these tend to concern secondary details of the narratives, and the historical core remains the same across all the gospels, as well as in Paul. And so these kinds of inconsistencies would be expected in any sort of historical accounts, and therefore really don't detract from the historical core of those narratives that I summarized under those three headings earlier.
Okay, let me give you what I think is one of the more sophisticated critiques of the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. A little complex, but let's start. The claim is that Jesus died around 30 in the Common Era, and that Paul is writing around 50 in the Common Era, whereas the Gospels are written between 70 and 100 of the Common Era. Mark maybe being first, around 80, and maybe even beyond 100. And they're being written after the fall and destruction of Jerusalem, which creates a whole different sort of theological environment. And that the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are put on these documents as opposed to those people actually writing them because of the historicity of it. And when you do that, the argument is that Paul then becomes primary evidence because he is writing first in this narrative. And Paul, the claim has a resurrected Jesus, of course, as the core of his theology, but it's Jesus with a spirit body. It's not Jesus as a physical body.
Yeah.
And then when the Gospels were written later, the physical body was imposed on that for theological reasons at the time. I mean, that's the argument.
Yeah. There's so much that could be said, Robert, in response to this. But let me cut to the chase and simply say that when Paul talks about the spiritual body, he does not mean a body made out of spirit. For Paul, that would have been a contradiction in terms. A body means a physical, corporal substance. To say that it's a spiritual body is to say that it is a body dominated and guided by the Holy Spirit, in contrast to the natural body, which is dominated by the sinful human nature. These same words are used a few chapters earlier by Paul when he contrasts the natural man and the spiritual man. Now, by a spiritual man, Paul obviously didn't mean an immaterial, intangible, invisible man. Rather, he meant a man under the domination of the Spirit of God. And it's the same contrast then, a few chapters later in 15, between the natural body, which is the sinful human body, mortal, corruptible, and so forth, and then the spiritual body, which is the body that will be raised, that will be immortal, incorruptible, glorious, and so forth. So this is definitely not a contrast between materiality and immateriality. And here I would say that commentators on 1 Corinthians 15 are virtually agreed on that point.
How important is it to the whole overall superstructure of Christian theology to have Jesus raised in a physical body, as opposed to Jesus' resurrection after 3 days and 3 nights in a spiritual body and spiritually going to God or appearing in some ways? How important is that physical body to the whole superstructure of the faith?
I don't think it's critical to the truth of the resurrection. I mean, imagine that God dematerialized Jesus' body in the tomb and somehow raised him to new life. That would still be a miracle that would cry out for explanation. Um, so while I think that it's false that Jesus lacked a material resurrection body, I don't think that the resurrection stands or falls with that question.
Bill, your work on the historicity of the resurrection is perhaps, from a contemporary point of view, probably the most thorough. Whether it is persuasive is another matter. Readers, viewers can discern themselves. But we all thank you for your contributions. We invite viewers to watch Closer to Truth videos with William Lane Craig at closertotruth.com or Closer to Truth's YouTube channel. We'll be doing more with Bill. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing.